February 1990, an elderly South African lawyer was freed from jail after 27 years. His name? Nelson Mandela. Why was his release greeted with such excitement all over the world? Nelson Mandela had become an international symbol of black resistance to white domination in South Africa. He was born in 1918, the nephew of the chief of his clan. As a boy, he grew up learning about black African history, the warriors and great chieftains who'd ruled before the days when white people took over the land. But when he went to missionary school, his teachers concentrated on white history, how the Dutch settlers, called Boers and later Afrikaners, had arrived in the 17th century and begun to move inland and farm. How the British had opened up the rich diamond and gold mines in the 19th century. How the two white groups fought each other several times for control of the land. And finally, how in 1910 a single South African state was set up, putting its government firmly in the hands of whites, whatever their origins. Nelson Mandela grew up in a country where black people had long been oppressed by white people. Many black farmers were poor and had to find extra work as miners for part of the year. But they could usually get only unskilled and low-paid jobs. What's more, their employers tried to make them carry passes, identity cards, to control who worked in white areas. 5 years before Mandela's birth, the Native Land Act of 1913 had stopped Africans from buying land from whites and forced them off land they'd farmed for years. Now they could only own land in reserves. These reserves then amounted to a mere 7% of the whole of South Africa. It became hard to make a living on this crowded land. Increasing numbers of blacks were forced to work in white areas for white employers. Yet in the 1930s, attempts were made to limit the number of Africans living in towns. They began to be forced into separate townships. All male blacks now needed a pass to get a job, to travel, or even to be out at night. But since they couldn't vote black people into Parliament, they had few ways to express their grievances.
There was really only one organisation in opposition, and that was the African National Congress, which was founded in 1912 in protest against the Native Land Act.
Its purpose was really to establish a voice, to bring about rights which had been taken away from our people.
It spread through the African townships, and by the 1940s, particularly in the urban areas, it was the most effective organization in the country.
Well, we had very brilliant young people then, educated, people like Nelson Mandela, people like Walter Sisulu himself, who was the driving force, people like Oliver Tambo.
Youth is the most important element in any political movement, so they formed the Youth League.
It galvanized the movement as a whole, and we all became influential in the circles of the African National Congress.
At this time, World War II was being fought in the name of freedom, democracy, and the end of oppression. In South Africa, black people hoped to achieve all three. But whites were vastly outnumbered by blacks, and democracy would mean the end of white power. In 1948, the Nationalist Party took over. It produced a theory, Apartheid, which stated that only by living and developing their ways of life separately could there be peace and progress for all races. A later president explained,
"Our policy is one which is called by an Afrikaans word apartheid. And I'm afraid that has been misunderstood so often. It could just as easily, and perhaps much better, be described as a policy of good neighborliness."
In fact, apartheid was a way of ensuring white domination. Soon everyone was classified as belonging to a particular racial group. White, Indian, coloured, and Bantu, or black. Those classified as white would live a privileged existence. So just as the rest of the world was rejecting racial segregation, South Africa made it part of the law of the land. And between 1949 and 1953, acts to enforce it piled up. 2 acts prevented the different races from marrying or living with each other.
People who were married in defiance of the Mixed Marriages Act were committing a criminal offence. They would go to prison.
The Group Areas Act set aside particular urban areas where whites, coloureds or Indians had to live, work or be educated. Black Africans, of course, had been forced into separate townships already. The so-called Abolition of Passes Act, in fact, made the pass laws more efficient and had them applied to women as well.
The pass laws were the most devilish part of apartheid because they applied to everyone over the age of 16. I had case after case of schoolboys or schoolgirls on their way home being arrested for not having a pass. Their parents didn't know where they were. The police never informed their parents that they'd been arrested. They just didn't come home.
The Bantu Education Act brought African education largely under state control. Black children had separate courses from white children, designed to keep the African in his place. Even so, education for blacks was neither compulsory nor free, and funding for black schools was reduced. Public services and public spaces were strictly segregated. By now, a new black urban culture had developed. Urban blacks, in particular, had become more politically aware. Their leaders decided to organize demonstrations against the government in what was called the Defiance Campaign.
We selected certain 6 laws, which we thought were very important and will have an impact on the whole campaign. And past laws was tabled as enemy number 1 to the black man.
The aim of the Defiance Campaign was to publicize what we were doing, and so we organized mass meetings. We deliberately encouraged people to defy, for example, the apartheid laws, which made them go into separate entrances if they wanted to buy a railway ticket, which refused them permission to sit on a park bench which was reserved for whites, and so on. And the object of that was to fill the prisons, and it succeeded because the prisons were so overfilled they simply couldn't cope with any more prisoners.
That year, Walter Sisulu helped Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo set up a law firm.
Oliver Tambo and Nelson Mandela were partners in the first black law firm in South Africa. They were very able, and they had youth on their side. They were young, and so they had an enormous influence throughout black South Africa.
For the first time, here was a firm of attorneys that did not call for a farthing, that had dedicated its practice to the defense of the people of South Africa. That's what made them important.
All those who tried to defend African rights strongly opposed the government's destruction of Sophiatown.
Now, Sophiatown was located in between suburbs, white suburbs, and therefore it became a black spot in the midst of those white suburbs, and therefore had to be moved in terms of the Group Areas Act.
And in fact, Sophiatown was the very first population removal. 60 to 70,000 people were pulled out of their homes by force. Their homes were bulldozed behind them. They were taken out by lorry loads and dumped on open ground.
Father Trevor Huddleston had been one of the foremost among those resisting the forced removals, though their resistance failed. But soon after, the biggest anti-apartheid movement so far got underway.
It was decided that the different movements of the congresses, the Indian Congress, the People's Congress it was called, for white people, the Coloured Congress and so on, should unite to have a great mass gathering outside Johannesburg, and their objective was to pass what came to be known as the Freedom Charter. This was based on the United Nations Charter of Human Rights, which explains itself, but in the South African context.
People sold the little that they had. Some would sell their goats, others would sell their cows, and others would sell their donkeys, others the little harvest that they had, to make sure that somebody from their region or from their area was sent to Kliptown.
The Freedom Charter is a most marvelous document, and it's a pity that people in this country and worldwide haven't bothered to read it.
The people shall govern. All national groups shall have equal rights. The people shall share in the country's wealth. The land shall be shared amongst all who work it. All shall be equal before the law. All shall enjoy equal human rights.
A year later, many of those present, including Sisulu, Tambo, and Mandela, were arrested and tried. The main charge was communism, then against the law. The trial lasted over 4 years. And at Sharpeville in 1960, the police had attacked a march against the pass laws staged by the blacks-only Pan-Africanist Party, or PAC. Many people were injured. 69 were killed, often while running away. The world was shocked and protested, but did little. The PAC and ANC were banned. Many leaders, like Oliver Tambo, now freed, went into exile to continue the struggle from abroad. In 1961, Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu were finally acquitted. Mandela, helped by Sisulu, organized a nationwide strike and then went underground. He traveled in secrecy around Africa and later went abroad to publicize the ANC's aims.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks.
The ANC formed Umkhonto we Sizwe, Spear of the Nation. Led by Mandela, its aim was to sabotage government property. In 1962, Mandela and Sisulu were arrested for calling the previous year's strike. Sisulu, out on bail, was found at the ANC base, where documents connecting them with Umkhonto were found. They were charged with planning violent revolution and tried once more. Mandela's behavior in the dock created a sensation.
He led the case for his own defense, and he made a magnificent speech at the end of the trial, which is often quoted, "The struggle is my life, and if necessary, I am prepared to die," and so on. So the world press recognized his quality of leadership. Of course, the black majority had recognized it all along.
Both Mandela and Sisulu were found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. A worldwide movement began to free Mandela, the hero of black Africa. It continued for 27 years. While Mandela and Sisulu were doing hard labor, Oliver Tambo was in exile. What was his role?
If you look at history and throughout the world, and look at the life of the exile, and you look at what Oliver Tambo has achieved, we owe much of today's situation to Oliver Tambo's work.
If it hadn't been for Oliver Tambo, the African National Congress wouldn't exist.
With the main black leaders in prison or exile, the whites continued their privileged existence. Cut off by apartheid, they had little understanding of the blacks' attitudes and the way they were changing. They had little to fear from the white liberal opposition and little to fear from the one legal Zulu-based black party. But back in 1957, a BBC reporter had said,
"They don't seem worried about the future in South Africa. But how it goes depends on what they think. Maybe they'll be content to accept the government's idea that they're inferior to the white man, and they'll be happy to grow up as second-class citizens in their own country. Or perhaps things will go the other way. In a few years' time, there could be a great African revolt, and those children might be taking part in it. I wonder.
When a really dramatic protest against the government came, it was from school children. A proposal to make Afrikaans an official teaching language brought them out on a huge march at Soweto in 1976. It was almost a repeat of Sharpeville. Once again, the world was shocked. Once again, the world did little about it. A sporting boycott of whites-only teams did do something to keep the world awake to the reality of racial segregation in this sports-mad country. And inside South Africa, the government made a few reforms. Black workers could now form trades unions. But they began to test their strength, organizing increasingly effective strikes and walkouts. In 1983, the United Democratic Front, the UDF, was formed. It had the same broad aims as the Freedom Charter of 1955. But since it renounced violence, it was allowed to survive. Two of its main aims, though, were to gain the release of Nelson Mandela and the unbanning of the ANC.
October elections.
One of its main supporters was the influential Anglican Archbishop Tutu, who actively encouraged foreign firms to boycott South Africa.
In that action,
the government again began to ease some of the restrictions on blacks. The Mixed Marriages Act was repealed, and a few wealthy blacks were accepted into white society. Whites voted to allow Indians and coloureds segregated representation in Parliament, but not black Africans. This caused great anger. Some Indians and coloureds refused to vote. The UDF and other groups protested all over the country. Some members of the African National Congress organised military attacks on South African targets. The ANC planned to make the black townships ungovernable. Its aim was to set up black alternatives to white-controlled local government. Street committees were organised to fight crime and clean up their areas. Students boycotted or staged sit-ins against the restrictive educational system. Blacks who supported the white government began to be killed. In 1985, a state of emergency was declared. The army went into the townships. Thousands more people were killed. Tens of thousands, including children, were detained without trial. Worried by the spread of violence, foreign investors withdrew their backing. Between economic pressure from abroad and unrest at home, it was clear that something had to be done. A split developed in South Africa. Some neo-Nazi groups emerged, determined to crush African resistance. But others recognized the need for reform. A new president, de Klerk, was elected in 1989 and promised,
"The National Party intends to create a new South Africa in which every South African can live in safety, prosperity and dignity as an individual and within a group."
In 1990, he decided to unban the forbidden political parties and to release Nelson Mandela, the symbol of black opposition to white dominance, and the main hope for a democratic, non-racial South Africa. Whatever the short-term results of this action, the situation in South Africa could never be the same again.
Comrades and fellow South Africans, I greet you all in the name of peace, democracy and freedom for all.